Okay, this is Connie Rufner. I am going to be the interviewer, and we are interviewing Dean Reichenbaugh
Right.
at Kittanning, Pennsylvania. And Dean, so when were you born?
When was I born?
Yeah.
October 9th, 1925.
And you lived through the Great Depression and through World War II.
Yes.
First, let me say thank you very much for your service. You told us that you went to the Army. You weren't even quite out of high
I
school
was in
yet.
the Navy.
The Navy, I'm sorry. You were in the Navy. And you weren't quite out of high school yet when you left?
Well, actually, they took me my last year in high school. I had enough credit that I would have graduated in the spring, but I went into service in January.
So you were drafted?
Yes,
And how old were you?
18.
18. And where did you go to? Did you go to boot camp?
I went to Great Lakes.
Okay, where's that
In Michigan. The Great Lakes is on the lake.
at?
Michigan.
Okay, on Lake Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And how did you go? Did you take a train?
Yeah, they put us on a train in Apollo. It took us.
And so you went into the Navy.
Yes.
And how long was your training?
Was there in January, February, and March, I believe, part of March.
And what year was that when they drafted you? January of what year?
Of 44.
44.
Mhm.
So do you remember Pearl Harbor Day?
Oh, yes. Real well.
How did you hear about it?
On the radio. We heard radio, and it was on a Sunday when I heard it. Well, the day that it happened.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Had you been expecting something like that?
No, not really. No.
So where did you go? Where were you assigned first? Where did you go?
Great Lakes to.
And then after that, where did you go?
To Sullivan's, Maryland, to gunnery school.
So you were a gunner?
Yes.
And then what ship did you serve on?
On an LSD.
Did you? And where at? In the Pacific?
Yes. In the Philippines was Lady was our home base in the
Uh-huh.
Philippines.
What was that like, going to the Philippines?
Well, actually we weren't allowed off the boat, off the ship. We just anchored there. That was our place to go anchor when we had to go in. And those Filipinos, they passed the no small boats or whatever there was, and we wasn't allowed to buy anything off of them. Nothing. We wasn't allowed to buy bananas or anything at all. And they wasn't allowed to come to a ship or nothing because dysentery and stuff. They were crummy people. I mean, dirty. They didn't have. Well, it wasn't their fault. They didn't have the stuff, I guess. So I wasn't allowed to the shore or anything. And there was one little church there in Leyte, right off the shore. And I would see the women going to church every morning. They'd go with their big home rolled cigars, smoking a big cigar, and going to church. And so I asked the skipper one day, I said, would it be possible for you to take us in a small boat and go over there? I'd like to see inside that church. And he said, so would I. So he said, we'll go. And we went, and here there was no pews or anything in the church. It was just ladies sitting there smoking their homemade cigars, their home-rolled cigars. And no minister or anything. I just sit there, and I guess I was saying prayers or worshiping. And was only allowed in there, I think, for 5 minutes or something like that, and then we got to leave. And outside of that, we had nothing to do with with the Filipino people because they were dysentery. They was afraid of getting dysentery started because they wasn't clean at all. They were, I mean, it wasn't their fault, I guess. And they just lived in huts along Leyte. Leyte was a inlet where we went in when it was storms and stuff to protect us. And but we wasn't allowed to handle them.
Tell us about the LST. What was that? What kind of boat was it? What was it like?
Landing craft.
Right. Uh-huh.
They took the troops and jeeps and stuff into the beach when they went to make a landing.
And you were on the crew for the LST.
Yeah.
And how big were the crew quarters?
Oh, crew quarters wasn't real large. Well, part of my time was on LCT too, when they'd take troops in. They was smaller,
Mm-hmm.
but we could still haul tanks and things in, and troops. And then we'd leave them off and then we'd come back to Leyte.
So which landings were you in on?
Well, just landings around there where they're trying to take the islands
Uh-huh.
and get things secured. So I don't know what the name of them, some of them was. They were just,
You just went?
I wasn't, when, before the war ended, they had us about ready to go to Japan, but we didn't have to go. The war ended, Truman left them drop them bombs and that soon settled it.
Was that a relief to you?
Yes, oh man, it was a great relief.
How did you hear about that?
Well, we had the radios, we heard everything was going on everywhere. They had their, not radios that they broadcast like but they had their radios that was just for the personnel, for the people on board ship, the skipper and the officers and them got the news. They knew everything was going on all the time, everywhere. Because they had them, well, radios of some kind that they could talk, and, they let the officers know everything that was going on. And then they would tell us what was, like we knew as soon as they dropped them bombs in Japan, that were the worst bombs that was ever dropped. Wiped the whole city out at a time. We heard about that right away. So we figured the war was going to be over before too long.
Did you have any idea that they were working on some kind of weapon like that?
No, they didn't tell us that kind of stuff. Not more than that powerful anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But then the eats aboard the ship weren't good, but they weren't bad. And our cook was head cook was from New Jersey, Orange, New Jersey, and he was a fairly good cook for, he was the head of the cook. And they had to have coffee for you 24 hours a day if you could drink it. But it was, over there you didn't have no fresh water, everything was chlorine water. And you held your nose to drink it. And cause you couldn't drink it if you didn't, with the chlorine in it. And then they'd bring out water, the ship would come with water every 3 or 4 months and take the lid off of some of them tanks that they put down in and fill them up again with water, but it was chlorine water. So I can't, as soon as now I get if they give me any water anywhere that has chlorine, and boy, I can, my nose picks it up right away, I can't. And then they didn't, over there with the guns and stuff, they never give me no hearing aids, blocks. You didn't have anything for in your ears to stop that noise. And when I came home, I went to West Leechburg to work, to Allegate, London, and they hired me right away. But the day that I took my test to get in, they said, "My goodness," they said, "are you hard of hearing?" And I said, "Yeah, I realize I am." So I'm wearing hearing aids now. And that helps a lot, but they're a nuisance, of course. And they gave me my first set, but that was all. And boy, they're expensive. Real expensive to buy your hearing aids and keep it going. But I got a good daughter and a good son. I just have the 2 children. And like I said, my daughter's up on there and my son's there. That's my daughter and her husband there, and that's my son and his wife.
You have a very handsome family.
Thank you.
So were you married? Oh, you weren't married then when
No,
you went to
no.
work because you were too young. You were too
No.
young.
I was too young.
Now, did you have a sweetheart?
Yeah, in a way. But you didn't get time to write, and there wasn't nothing to write, and then when we did write, they censored it and tried to snap out what you said. So most of it just writing to my mother and father trying to keep them informed a little bit, but I would get packages from the girl that I was seeing some once in a while. She'd send me a package with, if you got it. Sometimes you didn't even get your package this day.
What kind of stuff was in it?
Cookies and that kind of stuff. That's about all they could send, anything that wouldn't spoil. My mother should always make, and my aunts and them would make me boxes and send. Sometimes you wouldn't even get them because, well, I think the ones at the post office, they were service people too, and I think they thought, oh boy, bet there's some good stuff in that box, and I can't prove that, but you didn't get your packages sometimes anyway when you thought you would.
Did you share them?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
When you got a package, everybody gathered around and they let you get the first cookie or whatever was in it out, and then look out. By that time, that's gone. Which I didn't mind. I mean, they all done. Everybody shared when they got a package. The guys would gather around, and you didn't. As soon as you opened it, you looked in and got 2 or 3 cookies out, and boom, everything else was gone.
What kind of cookies did they send?
Well, just cookies that wouldn't spoil, just regular cookies, sugar cookies and that kind of stuff. And then they'd send some candy. Sometimes the packages have candy in.
So how many men were on the LST in the crew? How many were in the crew on the LST?
About 50-some. Oh, they were big.
I was going to say, that's bigger than I realized. Of course, if they were big enough to carry tanks, they had to be pretty big.
And then they were flat bottomed, They were flat. They were rough riding. Because when you kind of hit the waves and stuff, you didn't cut through them. You went over top of them and flopped down.
So did you have to wait for relatively calm seas in order to do it, or did you just go ahead anyway?
No, you went ahead anyway. Well, if they gave tornado warnings or something, then you got in because I saw it one time it was in Lady Bay. That's was our home base like, and all the ships would go in there, and I saw one of these big aircraft carriers coming in there one day, and he got caught out in the ocean in the storm. And you know where the flight deck is way out over the bow? It was smashed down over the bow, the waves and stuff smashed it down over the bow. It was that rough, the
Wow.
water. But you'd see when we'd get in rough seas, you'd look out the side and you'd see a ship way up here, and after a bit it would disappear and you was way up there. All the waves was terrible out there, some storm. But we go through it, safe. And one thing that was in my favor was that I never got seasick. And most of them got seasick. We had one poor guy, I pitied him. He was from North Carolina, and he had two small children too at home, and when we'd have to go out, he was seasick as soon as they said pull anchor, why he was seasick. And he would say, and then we had several guys, pretty much everybody aboard got seasick. And I wasn't supposed to take the wheel, to steer. I wasn't supposed to be that because I was the gunner's mate. But when we got real rough water out here, the skipper, Reichenbaugh, please report to the wheel house, and I knew right away I was going to have to take the wheel because everybody else was seasick. And it was supposed to be on there, and I wasn't supposed to be, but he always used me. He liked me. He was, because I was the youngest one aboard ship.
Uh-huh.
When I went aboard, I was 18 years old, and I was the youngest one. All the rest was, well, there was some in their 20s, but most of them was in their 30s, early 30s years old. And most of them had families and children, their own. But, and the skipper said one day, he said, how do you keep from getting seasick? I said, well, I don't know. I said, I guess my stomach just goes up and down with the waves or something. I said, don't bother me. And it didn't. I never, thank God I didn't, because that's miserable, for ones that got seasick.
How did you wind up in the Navy?
Well, I was drafted, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And when I went down to Pittsburgh for my exam the day I had to go, well, they took us in a bus. They took a bus load of us. And I went straight through. They didn't find anything wrong because I was just 18 years old. And when I come down to the end, I was one of the first ones through because they didn't hold me up in anything. And I went in and they set me down there, and I talked to an officer, and he said, asked me a lot of questions, of course, about school and that kind of stuff. And then he said, what do you want in? And I said, I guess the Army. And he said, why the Army? And I said, well, all my friends that went ahead of me, I said, are in the Army. I said, my brother's in the Army. And he said, you wasn't built for the Army, you was built for the Navy. And he stamped Navy in all my papers. Thank goodness he did, or I mightn't be here today.
Yeah. And you turned out to be a good choice because you didn't get seasick.
Yeah, it turned out to be a good choice. And he just, like I said, he just stamped Navy on all my papers, and I was one of the first ones done with my physicals and stuff, so he said, well, you'll just have to sit around till the bus comes this evening, because he said some of these guys won't be through for a while yet. So then they sent us home, was home for 2 weeks. Now the ones that they took, that went to the Armory, they had a month after they took their physical, but the ones that went to the Navy only had 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks I was in boot camp up at Great Lakes, Illinois.
Do you remember the end of the war?
Oh yeah, we was the first ones that knew that it was, over. They put it on, told all the skippers on all the boats, all the ships, and everybody knew it right away. The war ended, that they gave up. And of course, everybody started celebrating, you know, cheering, and we was in Lady Gulf then, and we were anchored when because there was a rumor that they was going to send us to Japan, you know, that they was going to make a landing there. And we knew if they made a landing in Japan, there was going to be a lot of lives really lost. So everybody was really excited when they said that they dropped them bombs and that they gave up. So we didn't, we was right there in Lady Gulf, and everybody, of course, started celebrating. You didn't have much to celebrate with, except cheering and running around. Well, it was, I suppose, a month or so later, then they brought some different food and stuff out, of course, and one thing they brought was a case of Coke and a case of toddy, and that toddy was the best chocolate drink I ever in my life drank. It would come in cans. And they gave us that kind of stuff about a month after the war was over.
How long were you there after the war was over?
About 4 or 5 months.
Really?
Because I was youngest aboard ship, and they took you according to how old you was and how much of a family you had. So that, like that guy from North Carolina, I said, was sick all the time. Or the skipper was the first one to go, and he wasn't that old. He wasn't even married, but they took some of the officers and brought some of them other officers out from states that thought they knew more than we did, and then the crew kept getting smaller till it wasn't big enough. Then they would move you to another boat of the same kind, and they kept moving you to different ships, you know, to get you because that's enough to have a crew to run a ship. Well, then so I was the only one who was still originally went out there, was still there because I was the youngest. And then finally one day they said, Reichenbaugh, they said, pack up because you're leaving tomorrow for home. And I said, oh, thank God. Well, they took us to one of these great big ships. I mean, it was enormous. And it was packed with men, you know, and everything. And I got a little bit acquainted with another guy there, and I said, boy, this is going to be some trip home with all these guys aboard here. And he said, oh, man, he said, I don't know what we're going to do. And well, that night they assigned me and him to quarters down below, and it was right above the engine room, and you were just shaking and hot. Oh, you couldn't stand it. And so I said to him, let's sleep on top deck. If they don't catch us, we'll be all right. So we went up, took his blanket, and went up on top deck. About the middle of the night, I felt somebody kicking me on the bottom of the feet. And here it was an officer, and he said, what are you doing up here? And I said, I couldn't stand it down there. I said, right above the engine room. I said, I couldn't sleep. And he said, what's your name? I told him, and he had a record there for us. He looked and he said, oh, you was a gunner's mate? And I said, yes. He said, I'm going to have a job for you tomorrow on your way home. And then he asked the other guy who was with me what he done, and he told him, and he said he was a cook, and he said, I'll have a job for you too. He said, you can report to my office the first thing in the morning, and he said, we'll assign you to another quarters. So my job was, they gave everybody a little card of different colors, and then say, yellow's going to have breakfast first tomorrow morning. And so I had to stand up there, I had a gun and everything, and watch them guys, and they had to show me their yellow card that they was first. And if they wasn't, then I had to shove them out of line. And then take, the other guys maybe had a red card, and they'd take them next for breakfast. And that was my job on the way home, seeing if the guys that had the right colored card was in that line for first breakfast and stuff. If not yet, I told them to get out. So then they assigned me different bunks too. I slept up with the crew. They put me in a bunk and up with the crew, so I had a pretty nice bunk. Not nice compared to what you have here, but for where I was the first night. And so that's where I was till I came home. Then we stopped at Hawaii for one night, and then we come on to California. So we went through under the Golden Gate Bridge. Because everybody, that was the old saying aboard ship, you'll see the Golden Gate in 48, but it happened before that. So then I got in, then they put us, of course, in Navy base there, and they started saying you wanted to go home, and everybody was going home, and I wasn't. And I knew I wasn't for discharge, but you should get home for a leave.
Mm-hmm.
So I went in and asked to see the main officer one day, and they said, well, we'll see if he'll see you. And he took me in, and he said, what's your problem? And I told him how long I'd been there. Oh my goodness, he said, you should have been going home before this for leave. And he said, what? And he got my record out right away, and he said, oh, he said, I'm sorry. He said, we missed you. He said, you should have been gone 2 weeks ago. So he said, I'll tell you what, he said, I got a trip into town, he said, in about an hour, and he said, you be packed, and he said, you'll get in a Jeep with me, and he said, I'll take you to the railroad station and make sure you get out of here. And I said, well, thank you, and he did, and he took me to the railroad station, and I got in there, and I asked for a Pullman train home.
Uh-huh.
Didn't have any. They said you have to ride in the coach. And I said, oh, no, I can't. That's a 3-day trip night. Sitting there, and so then they said, you won't go this evening. So I went in for lunch into a restaurant, and it was filled. And I said, there was one seat, and there was a lady sitting there by herself, an older lady. And she said, you can sit with me. And I went over there and sat down, and she said, are you waiting to go home? And I said, yeah, and I told her what happened. She said, you're going with me right after we eat lunch. She said, I work in the railroad station. She said, I'll see what I can do for you. I said, well, that would sure be nice of you. So I said, well, I'll get your lunch for you. And she said, oh no, I'm getting your lunch for you. And after what you did, and so we went over to the train station right as soon as we ate. And she said, give me your ticket, and come on in here and sit down, wait. I gave her my ticket, and she said, now this is if I can get your Pullman, she said, you know it'll cost you more money. And I said, I don't care. So in about half hour she came back and she said, you're getting on a Pullman at 6 o'clock tonight. And she said, you'll be on your, and she said, it makes 2 stops between here and Chicago. She said, it's one of the fast ones. And she said, you'll have to pay the difference. And I said, oh, I'll gladly do that. So I got on the train that night, and I was on there 2 nights, and the next morning while I was in Chicago. Then I got off of there, and I had to catch, I couldn't get in of course, just a regular train home. And I went out, got the taxi, and I told him when I was catching my train, and he said, oh my, he said, that's great the other side of the city. He said, well, we'll have to break the records in driving. No, did we go across that city? And when we got out, he said, get in there right away. He said, that train's getting ready to leave. And when I went through the gate, they said, what are you for? And I said, what train I was getting, and they said, get in through the gate right away. They said, they're closing the gate. They said, that train's starting to pull out. Oh boy, it wasn't no Pullman. Till I got to Pittsburgh, I looked like I was colored. It was one of them old trains that the smoke and stuff come in the windows and oh, you just about smothered. But I didn't care. So when I got to Pittsburgh, I called my mother and dad right away and told them I was there. And because I knew they'd come to get me right away. But I said, don't hurry, because I said, I got to shower and change clothes and everything before I get out of here. So I said, give me an hour and a half or so anyway. And I said, now I'll get something to bite to eat and get showered up and get some clean clothes on. Because as in whites then, it was warm. But when I got off of that train, they weren't white. They were more black than they were white, because it was one of them old trains, and they said, when you're the smoke just come in at the windows like, oh. And then the guy was sitting beside me, he, on the train, he was the same, he was as black as I was from the dirt. And then finally I just happened to look out the window, it was just getting daylight in the morning. And I looked out the window and I saw, that was one of them signs when you go from one state to another, you know, they say. And I saw it said, this big sign I saw out there said Pennsylvania, right along the railroad tracks. And I looked at the guy next to me, I knew he didn't see it, and I said, well, we're in Pennsylvania. He said, how do you know? And I said, smell the air. I said, we're in Pennsylvania. And he said, oh, come on. And just by that time, by they announced over the intercom, we just now came into Pennsylvania. He was going on to New Jersey. So he said, you saw something, I told you. And I said, yeah, I saw the sign that said Pennsylvania. So then I got my supper and got a shower and stuff. And by that time, my mother and dad was there. Well, my dad wasn't. He was working. But my brother and his wife and my mother came down and picked me up. And again, I got home, my dad was just getting off work, and was he ever tickled? Oh man, he was I had good parents, real good. And my brother, I just had one brother. My sister died when she was 2 days old. She never lived. And then he should have been the oldest. And then I had a brother, he was older than me. And then I was in home too. He got married, and he married a beautiful, wonderful woman. And they moved down south though. And he got cancer, bone cancer. And oh, he just suffered, and he didn't live too long till he passed away.
Did he serve in the military too?
He served in the Army, but he was lucky, had something to do with airplanes, and he done something to all the planes every morning. I just don't know what it was, but they never sent him overseas. They kept him at that base, and that was his job every morning, to do this to the motor on these planes, whatever it was. And so they kept him there, and then that's why when he got married down there. His wife come down, his girlfriend that was in, and she come down, and they got married there on the base. And then they gave them a place on the base to live together on, an apartment. So, but then after they got married, got home, he had 3 children, and then he got this bone cancer. And he died a terrible life. Mm-hmm. That bone cancer, just keeps moving. When they get it, think they have it cured one place, it breaks out somewhere else.
How old was he?
He was in his around early 50s.
That's young.
He got the cancer though in his late 40s. And he lived, I don't know how many years of this. And
So, what did he do after the war then? Was he still a mechanic then?
no, he went to West Leaford to Allegheny, London.
So both you did?
and both of us did. We had an uncle that there was a superintendent of the carpenter shop, and he could help you to get in, you know. If you haven't, well, it's like anything else, if you know somebody, it helps.
Yeah, yeah.
And, of course, he was home before I was because he was older than I was. So he was already working at the mill when I got out of the Navy. And he worked with one of them big annealing lines. And then my uncle said, my uncle's worked down there and he was superintendent of the carpenter shop. And then he said, would you like to, did you put an application in at the mill? And I said, oh yeah. And he said, well, I'll talk to him and see what I can do for you. Well, then about 2 weeks they called me to come down. And I worked in the shipping office. I worked in the shipping office as a shipping clerk. But it was 24 hours a day. I mean, I had to be there. You work night turn too because I build trucks and stuff when they come in, what they're getting. And them truck drivers, you know, they don't never stay home at night. So I worked turns. And then finally one day, Ted Brewer he was the head guy over all the farming and everybody. And he come to me and he said, boy, he said, I looked up your record, Dean. He said, you've been president in the North Apollo Firemen. And he said, that's a good outfit up there. He said, you've been everything up there, trustees. And he said, I'm going to have an opening here. He said, because they was threatening that they was going to put computers, was going to take our places in the office, you know. And he said, I'll have a job for you. He said, you'll work for me if you want to. And I said, well, I'll try it. But he said, you'll be in 24-hour call all the time. And well, that was kind of a mistake, but Ted Brewer was a good guy though. And then I took it and was only on there for less than a year, and my wife got and I had to take her to the hospital, and that was in February, 1st of February, took her to the hospital, and she never got out of the hospital till September.
Oh my.
Because they just, that lung cancer was just eating her up, and then they sent her home. They surprised me one day and I went down and they said, we're sending your wife home tomorrow. Well, I said, what am I going to do? They said, oh, we'll furnish you a hospital bed and stuff. And then we'll have a nurse that'll come in every day. And so then she lived till about 10 days till after Christmas, and she passed away.
Sorry.
And when she passed away, I know she weighed 50 pounds. She had just skin and bone, and she was a good wife, a wonderful wife. And then we had two children, a boy and a girl.
When did you meet her?
My wife?
When did you meet her?
Right shortly after I come home from the Navy, we got married. Because that other, the girl that I was sending me packages and stuff, that I went with we went to dance and stuff, that was before I went to the service. Here she met another guy, and you know, he was home before me, and because I was young, and she was engaged when I come home. Well, she wouldn't told me about what was going on, and so then I started going to the dances myself after I got home, and then I met my wife that I married. And the other one, the girl that got married, you know, right after I got home, the other girlfriend, she got sick and didn't live long after I come. So, I've had good days and I've had some bad ones. then my wife passed away and I kept working and I didn't mind then going out so much, you know, because it was, I was on 24-hour call at the mill and they knew I was home by myself. Gee, my phone was ringing sometime before I got home because they gave me a phone to carry too. Sometime before I got home, I'd say, turn around, come right back. And I'd go right back. They had problems. Because any time on some big operations, there was a lot of operation under the floor too, you know, and they had that kerosene and stuff that they used to make steel when it was dripping down in. So when they go to have a breakdown, they wasn't allowed to burn down in there until they called me or Ted Brewer or the fire chief, and we had to get the labor pool up there and clean it all out, make sure that there, because with that kerosene stuff down in there and rags hanging, because them guys was careless at work. They had big buckets or barrels for them to throw their dirty rags in. You think I'd throw them in, they just toss them over there to the pit and leave them get down in and it'd hang somewhere. And one spark or something would start and burn it, so I had to get the labor pool in to come clean all them rags and stuff out before I could leave them burn, whatever was broke down. So then finally it was, well then of course, like I said, I lost my wife in the meantime. And then I retired and after I retired, why the kids said, because I'd go to Myrtle Beach with them when they went on their vacation and stuff, and they said, why don't you go and run bus trips? Butler Motors had bus trips, you know, all the time, nice bus trips. So I said, oh, I don't know. And they said, well, why don't you try one? So I went on a bus trip. And that's where I met my wife, that I got now. On one of those bus trips to South Carolina. She was on the bus trip. Her husband died in Coal Bank with a heart attack. So they've been married ever since. And then this happened. Of course, it's why she has a room and I have one. Her room's a little bigger than this, and I couldn't come here at first. I went over to Katanning Care Center after I got out of the hospital here. And so that's my life.
So now you're right next door. Now you're right next door.
Yeah, we're next door.
So do you remember the Depression?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I can remember my dad, he was working at the old Apollo steel mill at the time. I remember, then everybody didn't have phones either, but my grandmother lived right next door to us, and she had a phone because she was postmaster at Spring Church. And so she had to have a phone, and they would call her house, and I remember when I was down there every day at my grandmother's because I loved all them. And I remember them telling me, oh, run up and tell your dad he don't have no work tonight. They called, and he had very little work during the Depression, you know. And then he went into work one morning to go to work at the Apollo mill, and everything was closed. That guy never gave them no notice. None of them poor guys ever got a pension or anything. He just had a big sign up out front, closed, and he just shut it down. And Oppenheimer was his name, from Pittsburgh. They never got no pension, no nothing.
So how did you get by?
Well, I was married, of course, at the time, but my mother and dad, and Dad knew the guy was at the head of the Apollo Ridge schools real well. And right away they offered Dad, they knew he was a good worker, and they said, hey, we need a janitor for the new school. I said, how about you taking it? And so he took that, he cleaned the rooms, and of course it was powered by coal then, and he had to be over there, in the winter, he had to be over there at 3 o'clock in the morning sometimes, firing up, to get that whole, it wasn't the high school, but it was the elementary school. It was right there in Spring Church, it was a new school.
Thank you so much.
You're
It's
welcome.
really been a privilege, and I really appreciate you talking to us.